everyone, I'm Hank.
I'm Kate.
And today we're in space because we're making a spaceship object.
Woo!
So we're going to talk about getters and setters, arguments and parameters, and the this keyword in classes.
Awesome.
So when Hank and I were trying to decide about our spaceship object, we had to think about what kind of things is a spaceship made of? What are the essential fields of a spaceship? So we went ahead and made a new class called Spaceship, and then at the top of our class we're going to go ahead and make our fields. And remember that fields are the same things as instance variables. And why do we call them instance variables? That's because in every instance of a spaceship you make, they're going to be there. They're going to be used. They're not just local variables that are only used if you call a certain method. They're going to be associated with every instance of a spaceship. So let's go ahead and think of some instance variables that we need for every spaceship. Well, every spaceship needs a name, so let's make a string name. Every spaceship travels, right? So let's go ahead and make an integer that is the number of light years traveled. And spaceships have passengers, just like Hank and I. So let's make an array of strings, so an array of the people's names that are in the spaceship, and call it passengers. And then finally, we need to know how many people can fit in the spaceship so we know how big our array of passengers is. So let's make an int that's num of passengers. Great. Okay, now that we have our field set up, let's go ahead and make our constructor. And remember, the name of your constructor is the same thing as the name of your class. So all we have to say is public spaceship. But now, these parentheses aren't going to be empty because our spaceship needs to know its name when we build it, and it needs to know what is the total capacity when we build it. So in these parentheses, we're going to put those parameter declarations. So we're going to say string name, and then we're also going to say int capacity. And so remember, these are parameters. And with parameters, they have arguments that we're going to pass in later on. For instance, if we were to fly over here to the main method and go ahead and make a new constructor, a new spaceship, then we would say spaceship, and let's name it Akaye, because that sounds cool, equals new spaceship. And let's say name, quotes, Akaye, and then capacity, kind of small spaceship, 4 people. So Akaye, this string, and 4 are going to fly back over here to the constructor and are going to be inserted where these parameters are. And then it's going to go in and fill in to be initialized as our field values. So let's go ahead and make those field values. Let's go ahead and initialize them. So we'll say underscore name equals that parameter that we pass in an argument for later, Akaye. Okay, and then next we're going to do light years equals 0, because when you first make a spaceship, it's traveled 0 light years, correct? Okay, and then third, we're going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and initialize the number of passengers to be 0, 2. Because when you build a spaceship, when it's first there, there's no one inside it. So we'll say num of passengers equals 0. And finally, let's go ahead and initialize our string array of passengers. So we'll say passengers equals new string, and then in these brackets, we're going to go ahead and use our parameter, and we're going to put capacity there. Because when you initialize an array, you need to say how big it is, which is why we had to pass in the capacity with the new spaceship that we made. Great, so those are our fields, and that's when we initialized it. And now we can move on to making methods, making what this spaceship does.
Great, so the first method we're going to make is called a getter. And a getter does just that. It just gets one of our field values and returns that value. So we're going to make a method called getName that we can call later that just returns the name of that instance of the spaceship. So we're going to start off public, and we know the return type of this method is the same as the field we want to return. So for this case, that's string. And then this method doesn't take any parameters because no matter what, it just returns our name. And inside the method body, we're only going to have a return statement. We're just going to say return underscore name, our field value. So getters are pretty simple. They just return one of the fields. So now we're going to make a setter for that same field. And this is a pretty common convention in Java or object-oriented programming, is having a field and then a getter and a setter for that field. So we're going to start off this method with public void setName, And notice that the return type of our getter method was a string because it returned the name value, which is a string. But the return type of this method is void because this method doesn't return anything. It doesn't give us back any value to use later. It just sets something inside the instance and then is done. So the return type of a setter is void. And we're going to call it setName, and this time we need to pass in a parameter because we want to give this method something to set the name to, right? So every time we call setName, we're going to pass it a string, and for the setter we're going to call it name. So inside the method body now, all we're going to do is say _name, our field or instance variable, is assign the value name, which we passed in as an argument to the name parameter. Great, so now we've got a getter and setter for our name field. But this isn't a very interesting spaceship so far. We can just do stuff with the name. So let's add a slightly more interesting method. How about for adding a passenger? So adding a passenger doesn't give us back any value we want, so the return type is going to be void. So we're going to start off by saying public void add passenger. But if we think about it, we want this method to be able to take in an argument or input, right? So we need to add a parameter. And we need to give this method a string of the name of the person that we want to add to our passengers array. So we're going to, inside the parentheses of the method header, say string name. And notice we can name this parameter the same thing as we did in the setter, because it's local to just this method. So inside this method, name will mean the name of the person that we pass in as an argument, but inside the setter, it meant the name of the person, or the name of the spaceship that we wanted to set. Cool, so now inside this method body, first off we're going to have an if statement, because we only want to be able to add a passenger if our spaceship isn't full still. So we're going to make an if statement and say if number of passengers is less than _passengers.length. So what's going on here is we have this number of passengers field that keeps track of how many people have boarded our spaceship. And then we have this passengers array that in the constructor we initialize to hold the maximum number of passengers that this spaceship can, or the capacity of this spaceship. So by getting the length of our passengers array, we're getting the maximum capacity of our spaceship. So if less people have boarded the spaceship than the spaceship can hold, then we want to be able to add a passenger. So inside this if statement, we know we have this number of passengers field that keeps track of how many people have boarded the spaceship already. So we can use that as an index to get the index that we want to add this passenger to. So we're adding this passenger to our passengers array, so we're going to say _passengers, and inside this brackets, put that number of passengers variable. So if there were 2 people in our spaceship to start off, number of passengers would be 2, and that would be the correct index to insert our next passenger to. And then, of course, after we've added a passenger, we have to increment our number of passengers by 1. And that's the add passengers method. And we can use system.out.println now to print out a value to our console in Eclipse whenever we want to in our code. So let's say at the end of our add passenger method, we system.out.println whoever we were adding, so name, is going to space. So every time we add a passenger, we should see printed out in our console, so-and-so is going to space. So now we can go back over to our main method and see that so-and-so is going to space gets printed out every time we add a passenger. So we have our spaceship Akaye, and we can call Akaye.addPassenger, and let's add me to the spaceship. So we can pass in the string Hank, and that will get plugged in as an argument to our name parameter. So we take this Hank string, the computer goes over to the spaceship class and plugs it in as an argument to our addPassenger method. And if we run our program, sure enough, we see Hank is going to space printed out. So if we wanted to keep track of everything that was going on in our spaceship and how many people were added, we could add a ton of print statements everywhere in our class, and that maybe could do what we wanted to. But what we really want to do at the end of the day is print out the state of our spaceship. So, you know, it would be ideal if Java would just know how to print a spaceship, right? And could just give us like a little representation of what our spaceship looked like. Turns out you can teach Java how to print anything you want by adding a toString method. So in our spaceship class now, we're not going to go into great detail about it, but we're going to add this toString method here that basically says whenever we try to print this object, run through this method and print whatever string it spits out. So now in our main class, when we say system.out.println akaye, we're passing in a spaceship, which is kind of weird. And if we don't have this toString method, Java will give us this really cryptic object signature. But if we have a toString method, then we can click run, and now we have a nice little printed out representation of our spaceship. And you can see that Hank is the first passenger and the rest are empty, and we haven't traveled anywhere yet.
So we can add passengers to the spaceship, so we're ready to launch. Okay, so we're in space now, and say we're in space and we want to travel. We want to move somewhere because we need to set up a satellite for the US space station, so let's make a method called travel. So once again, this is going to be a void method, because what it's going to do is it's going to change our light year's instance variable. So, it's going to change our light year's traveled instance variable. So we're going to say public void travel, and then we're going to pass in a parameter, because we love parameters, and it's going to be how many light years we're going to travel. So int light years travel. And we're doing this because we need to know how far we're going to travel when we tell our spaceship to travel. So now we go into our method, and all we're going to do is just add that number of light years to our light years instance variable. Perfect, we're done with our travel method. And because it's a void method, all it does is it runs from the top of the method to the last bracket, and we're done. We don't need a return statement. Great. And now we can travel, but sometimes there's other people in space, like aliens, and we need to get away from them as fast as possible. So we need a method that time warps us. So once again, this is going to be a void method, public void time warp. But we don't need parameters for this one, because what it's going to do is we're going to go inside our time warp method, and it's going to call our travel method, passing it a super large number of light years. So we're going to say this.travel 1000. So it's going to travel 1000 light years in one method. Okay, so this keyword this, a little confusing. When you use the keyword this, what you're saying is go to the method within inside this class that is called the following. So this dot go to travel. So we use this keyword this when we're calling a method of this inside the same class. So now let's go over to our main method and use these methods on our spaceship. So let's tell Akaye to travel 10 light years. So how do we do that? Take a second to think about it. Okay, perfect. We're going to do Akaye.travel 10. And now let's print this out and see if it shows that our light years was 10 greater. So remember, our light years were originally at 0. Okay, so let's system.out.println Akaye. Great, and you can see down here that it says we've traveled 10 light years now. Well, okay, alien comes in, we need to run away. Okay, let's time warp now. Okay, so how do we make Akaye time warp? Try it. Cool. So Akaye.time warp, and let's see what happens when we print this out now. System.out.println Akaye. And now it says he traveled 1010 light years. Woo! So when we put 10 into this travel, it takes this 10, the computer, and it goes to that method, so it goes to travel, and it inserts this argument as the parameter, and so this integer is going to go in and be light years for us. So the argument becomes a parameter. And there we go. So I hope this will help you time warp through your next problem set.
Thanks for watching. See you on the next video.